So the Battle Factory is the rental facility in the Frontier, it's the roguelike facility, and it's the most popular facility by far. This is the story of round 26 of Gen 3 Factory Doubles, played by LRXC. Remember that the gold print in singles is at the end of round 6. This is the longest ever fully live stream streak. I would say this is a very high level draft. There's a lot to learn from this, and I think it shows a lot of the differences in the knowledge levels involved. So what is so special about Gen 3 Factory in particular? Well, Gen 3 Factory has an IV bug. All the enemy Pokemon here are only 3 IVs, but the 6 Pokemon you get offered in your draft are going to be 31 IVs. This is effectively a 14 base stat nerf to every single stat for enemies. Or to put it another way, it's a bit like the 6 Pokemon you get offered are Mega Evolved compared to normal enemies. You have to take 3 of these into the first game. So the draft starts off with Armaldo 1. To be blunt about it, Armaldo 1 is bad. This is a bad singles Pokemon. Rock and Bug is bad defensive typing, Armaldo is very slow, and despite its high attack stat, the strongest move it has is only Ancient Power. But this is Doubles, and Doubles gives Armaldo 1 a bit of a different angle. Armaldo's biggest issue is that Water is an incredibly common enemy type, and Armaldo has a horrible matchup into most Water types. But in Generation 3, in Doubles, Surf has a 50% spread damage nerf, and Surf is by far the most common Water stab move in the game. This makes Armaldo actually usable into enemy waters. Armaldo also offers something very rare, and this is an actually strong stab rock attack. Most rock Pokemon struggle in doubles because Rock Slide hits both enemies and therefore has a 50% damage nerf, but Ancient Power doesn't suffer from this. Armaldo also has one of the very best moves in the game in doubles, which is Protect. Protect is an incredible resource against the way that the AI likes to play the game. Despite this, it's not all good news. Armaldo occupies a very troll speed tier at 65. Base 60 speed, 3 IV enemies are obviously at 66, and this is a devastating issue to have in doubles, to be just slower than the most common slow enemies.
Ooh, Raikou 1!
Raikou 1 is almost the opposite of Armaldo 1, because Raikou 1 is an incredible singles Pokemon. Not only is this super fast and hits super hard, but with the IV advantage in the factory, this is actually a very tanky Pokemon. To give an idea for this, a 31 IV Raikou easily lives Adamant Taurus's Earthquake so long as the Taurus is free IV, which it will be in the factory. Raikou also offers incredible safety into a quiet killer in Generation 3 Factory. See, in Generation 3, probably the single deadliest thing in the Frontier is Evasion, or more specifically, Evasion Cheese. Almost every somewhat tanky Pokemon in the game has a double team set. While Thunderbolt does not have perfect accuracy, after a few Calm Mind boosts, you only have to hit them once. This stops a lot of the double team rest enemies from potentially cheesing you. Now, it's not all good news for Raikou 1. Obviously, this thing cannot touch ground types and it cannot touch Pokemon with Volt Absorb. In singles, that's not such a big deal. A smart player can easily switch Raikou in or out to make sure it's going to be useful in the match. And in singles, even against something like Lantern, Raikou can probably stall out all of their PP and force a struggle war, which Raikou is very likely to win. In doubles, it's a lot worse. If the enemy leads with a powerful ground type and you can't instantly remove it, it may be impossible to have Raikou on the field when the enemy ground type isn't there. This doesn't just make Raikou bad, it can make Raikou a liability. In any scenario where a ground type is out or the enemy is threatening to have a ground type Pokemon in the back, you have to be very mindful of the Raikou 1v1 being stuck in a position where you are forced to lose. In other words, you have to babysit this Raikou and you have to live in constant fear of very specific lines that could happen involving enemy ground types. Despite this, there is a bit of good news. Earthquake specifically has special AI in Generation 3 doubles. The AI will often refuse to use Earthquake at all unless its enemy ally is immune to the move. This means that if Raikou is facing a Pokemon like Earthquake Tauros, so long as the other enemy isn't flying or levitating, it will be impossible for Tauros to actually click Earthquake while Raikou is still healthy. This makes the Earthquake weakness much less of a big deal. And also, while Raikou can be bad, with 2 potential targets on turn 1, it's pretty likely that one of them can be taken out directly by Thunderbolt, or be tagged down with an ally attack. All of that essentially means that Raikou really wants to be in the lead on turn 1.
Okay, we need an answer in the ground types, but that's not a bad mod. Yeah, it's good, but we need something that can handle ground types on lead. Sceptile would be perfect. Here we go. Okay, Fortress 4, I don't think I'm taking you.
Fortress 4 probably remains to this day one of the biggest noob traps in the game. Its moveset might look pretty good, and its stats maybe don't look too bad, and Bug Steel is actually pretty good typing, but the issue Fortress has is quite similar to Armaldo, which is the low speed. Now if you're bulky, having low speed isn't actually a problem in terms of dying, but there are worse things than death in doubles. Being slow in doubles makes you particularly vulnerable to several devastating moves like Confuse Ray and Hypnosis. Being so also leaves you open to moves that can flinch, moves that can burn or paralyze, and so on. It's actually arguable if doubles makes Fortress better or worse, and we'll talk more about Fortress in a bit.
Okay. Altaria 3, this is a Wildcat favorite. I don't really like this guy that much. I don't think it's very effective in doubles.
Altaria 3 is a weird set and arguably one of the sets that benefits most from the IV advantage. Despite this, Altaria can often be seen as a liability. The issue is specifically in the damage output and in the lack of offensive options in doubles. Earthquake is an exceptional move, but you have to have an ally that doesn't mind being on the field for that attack. Aerial Ace is a pretty bad move even with the stab bonus. Dragon Dance is a nice option in singles, but in doubles it's rare to have the time and capacity to actually click it. Probably the best thing about Altaria 3 is its item though. Lumberry is obviously incredible, as so many slower enemies are obsessed with clicking Thunder Wave, and it's also just very common to randomly pick up other status conditions during a fight.
Ooh, Lapras 1. Am I taking Lapras 1 in doubles? Let's see if it's Water Absorber or Shell Armor. It is Shell Armor, which honestly I like better in doubles.
Lapras 1 is a weird set. This is a max defense and special defense invested Pokemon, and alongside Shell Armor, Lapras lives almost every single move in the game except for a few stab focus punches and explosions. Lapras also benefits hugely from the IV advantage in its speed. Lapras is obviously base 60, but in the world of free IV enemies, this is more like base 74, and that includes a lot of very important outspeeds on the base 60 and 70 speed tiers. Unfortunately, it's not all good news for Lapras. While it is quite effective in singles, in doubles it must use Surf, which has spread damage nerf, and it also acts too slowly to reliably support most allies. It's also a bit like Raikou in the fact that it has some disastrous matchups against enemies with Water Absorb, and also a few very defensive enemies where it will struggle to break through with Surf alone.
Okay, that's interesting. Gyarados 2.
This is the special Gyarados set with 3 inaccurate moves. Now this may shock you, but Gyarados 2 is actually an incredible Pokemon. Special Gyarados may seem like a meme, but in Free IV land, this is actually a very serious set. Enemies being nerfed by 14 points in both HP and all defenses, more so kind of damage output you may be expecting. I'll put it this way. A modest 31 IV Gyarados almost hits as hard against free IV enemies as a modest Starmie does against 31 IV enemies. This makes Hydro Pump a very real move, and Gyarados actually has a long list of enemy Pokemon that it can knock out on its own. The coverage on Gyarados 2 is obviously excellent. The obvious downside here is the lower accuracy, and this is a very real issue. Having said that, Max Speed Gyarados is an incredibly fast Pokemon, and Intimidate is obviously the best ability in the game in doubles. The support Gyarados offers not only itself, but also its teammate can be invaluable. But I'd say the actual selling point of Gyarados 2 is fairly simple. This is a water type that has a good matchup into enemy water types. That's actually quite rare, and it's a very important trait to have in the factory. So this Gyarados set is a bit like the opposite of a noob trap. While it is true that physical Gyarados is better, we have to judge things in isolation and look at what is in front of us in the draft. This is similar to physical Latios, which is another set that is memed on by newer players, but is actually a very real option at 31 IVs. So this is LRXC's draft for round 26. But what should actually be taken? In factory doubles we must pick 3 Pokemon, 2 in the lead and 1 in the back. I'm going to talk through 2 seemingly obvious ideas that good players who may be new to the factory might find tempting. These are also ideas that LRXC immediately spotted on his livestream. The first is what I'm going to call Team Disneyland. So this is Fortress, Armaldo and Gyarados. The idea here is pretty simple. In Generation 3, Explosion has no spread nerf damage in doubles, and Explosion is still effectively a 500 base power move. In other words, unless you resist it, you're going to die. And even if you do resist it, you probably almost die, as Fortress 4 is actually pretty strong. So the idea is that Fortress explodes and Armaldo uses Protect. In theory, both enemies faint and then Gyarados comes in to intimidate the final enemy, and Armaldo and Gyarados together are in a 2 versus 1 scenario. There's actually a backup plan too. If the enemies resist Explosion, they're likely to be Rock or Steel types. In this case we can swap Armaldo into Gyarados and Fortress can use Earthquake. This way not only do the Rock and Steel types get intimidated, but are also just very likely to faint from Earthquake. Now that sounds great, but I've called this Team Disneyland for a reason. It's a strategy that's only really going to work in your dreams. In reality, the enemy AI can be a brutal opponent. And like I said, most sets do outspeed Fortress, even with the IV advantage. Flamethrower and Fire Punch are unfortunately both very popular random coverage moves, and Fortress's special defense is so bad that even some mean Pokemon like Machamp 4 can actually kill it with Flamethrower. But even forgetting that, a lot of other things can go wrong. Fortress can be slept, confused, it can be flinched, it can be intimidated and then not killed with explosion. There could be an enemy with the ability damp. What's worse, a lot of enemies like using moves like double team and curse, and even then, exploding can be a bad idea because of bright powder and focus band being annoyingly common. Yes, the occasional explosion might work, but this team has to win 7 games in a row. A slightly more considered team would be Fortress, Gyarados, and Armaldo or Altaria in the back. The idea here is a bit more thought out. It's true that Gyarados is weak to electric. Therefore, against an electric type, Fortress can Earthquake to take them out, and Gyarados can switch out to make sure it doesn't die. And Fortress is weak to fire, so Gyarados can Hydro Pump the enemy fire type, making sure that Fortress survives. On top of this, we also get the benefit of Intimidate and the naturally high defensive stats on all 3 Pokemon. So what is wrong with this idea? Well, it's another slight noob trap, unfortunately. Let's talk about the electric scenario first. Even forgetting some of the worst scenarios, how good is it really if Armaldo or Altaria get hit by a random Thunderbolt, the other enemy uses an attack, and then Fortress uses Earthquake? Given how slow the team is when Gyarados isn't on the field, it's debatable if we're even actually ahead here. Perhaps we temporarily be 3 versus 2 up, but the enemy is likely to hit back fast. With Gyarados coming back in later, we're probably in a decent spot, but it is easy to imagine this untangling if one of the other enemies has a random electric or fire coverage attack. And obviously this ignores some of the absolute worst case scenarios in the factory, like Zapdos, Latios or Gengar. All of these are going to force Gyarados out with Thunderbolt, but none of them are going to be hit by Earthquake. The fire scenario might actually be even worse than that. Although Gyarados 2 is fast, a lot of fire types are faster. If Charizard wants to kill Fortress, Fortress is going to go down. Gyarados is too slow to prevent this kill. Fortress could try and switch out, but a lot like before, it's not actually a great idea to switch into fire type attacks, particularly in multiple different games. What makes this even worse is the fact that Hydro Pump could just miss the slower fire types. In other words, the issue is often Fortress 4. It's just too slow. We'd be heavily relying on luck to make this work, and we're also locking out arguably the best Pokemon in this draft from being chosen, which is Raikou 1. So what team should we actually pick? Something that is hopefully obvious here is that there isn't a perfect team. Whatever we're going to pick, there will be some kind of vulnerability. While LRXC gave it a lot of thought, and you can watch his VOD to see all of that, I'm going to simplify things down a lot here. Sometimes it's a good idea to just pick your best Pokemon if you are unsure about what to do, and ride out the simple fact that at least with those Pokemon, you win a lot of the neutral type matchups. Here that is going to be Gyarados and Raikou without any doubt. It's pretty fortunate that Raikou actually really enjoys Intimidate support. Again, with the Intimidate support, Raikou is actually surviving most enemy stab Earthquakes, and like I said earlier, Earthquake has some pretty weird AI in Gen 3 doubles. Gyarados also appreciates Raikou for reasons that might become more obvious the more you think about it. Gyarados is most nervous about fast enemy Thunderbolts from Pokemon like Starmie and Gengar. 31 IV Raikou will murder these before they can use a move. Leading with a fast hero like this also allows for a lot of flexibility in turn 1 options. If an enemy shows up that we want to remove, the combination of both attacks from Raikou and Gyarados into that slot is likely to get rid of it. This includes a pretty long list of Pokemon, but as an example, we can get rid of Metagross immediately. The real question then is what should go in the back behind Gyarados and Raikou, and this is quite a hard question. I think Lapras is clearly not the answer for obvious reasons. Fortress is also a pretty bad idea if we're talking about intentionally switching it into fairly strong special moves, or into fairly strong Earthquakes even after Intimidate. Honestly, my opinion here is going to be Altaria. I like the fact that Altaria doesn't mind switching into Thunder Wave or Earthquake. I also like the fact that Altaria operates at a much higher speed tier than Armaldo. And something I haven't mentioned yet is Sing. While Sing has dreadful accuracy, a 55% chance to save the game shouldn't be underestimated. Altaria also just has very good natural special bulk and doesn't really mind taking a Thunderbolt aimed at Gyarados. Altaria itself does offer Earthquake for the enemy electrics. In the end, LRXC actually decided for Armaldo. There's a lot going for Armaldo also. The major idea here is certainly Protect. After taking a hit, enemies are extremely likely to try and focus down Armaldo. Protect essentially buys you 3 turns in these scenarios. I'm not going to call Armaldo wrong, I think this is more along the lines of a playstyle difference, but the other teams we mentioned, and particularly almost every team with Fortress in it, is what I would call a serious mistake in drafting. These are the kind of errors that players make, then lose the next game and complain that there was nothing they could do and the factory is a terrible game mode. It's understandable to say that, but in truth the factory is just a brutal skill test with almost no mercy. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the factory hint system. In Generation 3 you get 2 pieces of information in the factory. First up is the type hint. If the next enemy uses one type more than others, a type hint for that type will be given. For this battle there was no type reference, which likely means all 3 Pokemon share no types, although it is possible there could be a tie between multiple types. Second is the phrase hint. This is a bit more obscure. There are 7 possible phrases in the factory and then 2 special cases to bring the total up to 9. These 7 phrases are related to the types of moves that enemies could have. For example, the phrase high risk, high return means that the next enemy will have Pokemon with moves like Overheat, Guillotine, Double Edge, Hyper Beam, and Explosion. For this battle, there was no phrase specialty. That might be a big hint and it might not. It really depends on what's going to come out next. So LRXC enters Battle 1. Again, this is match 176 of the win streak. It's Entei and Weezing out first. Both of these Pokemon have 4 possible sets. Somewhat unusually for doubles, we actually know what the exact turn order is going to be. Raikou is the fastest Pokemon on the field, Entei is always second fastest, Gyarados is always third fastest, and Weezing is always going to act last. On top of this, the hints do give us a bit of information. First up, there is no Fire Poison type in Generation 3, and therefore the Pokemon in the back cannot be a Poison or a Fire type. On top of this, Weezing 2 on its own activates the phrase high risk, high reward, and therefore it cannot actually be Weezing 2. Any of the other Weezing sets are possible though. In a similar vein, it could be any Entei set. Because Entei 3 is high risk, and Weezing 3 and 4 are both high risk as well, it's very unlikely to be Entei 3. Other information that might not be immediately obvious about this turn is that Gyarados will easily kill Entei with Hydro Pump. Now what is the best plan for this turn? Let's start out with the most obvious one. We could Hydro Pump Entei, and we could Thunderbolt Weezing. This has several obvious upsides. First off, if we hit the Hydro Pump into Entei, it could go down, and if this is Weezing 3, then Weezing 3 will feint to Thunderbolt. Even if it's not Weezing 3, we still do heavy damage with Raikou's Thunderbolt into it. It's likely that this play would get us very far ahead, but there are a few problems with doing this. Another tempting play is to bring Armaldo in. While Armaldo cannot one-shot Entei with Ancient Power, it does have a very good matchup into Entei, and it also resists Weezing's Explosion, which is quite a big risk here. In terms of what Pokemon Armaldo should switch in for, you could make an argument for both. It is probably better to bring Gyarados out, as we can then Intimidate again later, and while we're doing this, Raikou could also use Calm Mind. The problem with the plan to switching Armaldo is that there's quite a lot of variance in what can go wrong. Because we're letting both enemies get an attack in, things can go quite badly wrong with either crits, or burns, or just pretty annoying moves like Smokescreen and Double Team. Let's talk about the first plan again, where we just Hydro Pump Entei and we Thunderbolt Weezing. What is wrong with this plan? There are 2 major problems with this. First up, if Entei dodges Hydro Pump, it could be setting up a Calm Mind or a Double Team. Both of this could lead to Entei being a quite big problem later on in the match. At only +1 special attack, it's not too much of a problem into Raikou, and Gyarados still does beat it, but we don't know what's in the back. The back Pokemon could easily be an electric type. There's also a problem with using Thunderbolt against Weezing. First up, we're not actually guaranteed to kill Weezing 3 because of Focus Band. If Focus Band activates, then Gyarados could feint to Thunderbolt. But this isn't really the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could actually happen on turn 1 is Explosion from Weezing. Even at full HP, this can happen in Generation 3. If Weezing does explode, it's likely every Pokemon on the field is going to feint, and we could be looking at a 1v1 with Armaldo against an unknown Pokemon. And like we said earlier, Armaldo isn't very trustworthy in these kind of late game 1v1s. On top of this, it actually could get worse. The most likely thing that Entei is going to do on turn 1 is Double Team, and if Entei double teams and Weezing explodes, it could actually be a 2v1 with Entei and its partner against Armaldo. Being on this big of a win streak is all about mitigating risk and making sure we make the best possible play to safely put us as far ahead as possible. In this scenario, it's actually rather simple. What we should do is double target into Weezing. This dramatically lowers the chance that Weezing ever survives the first turn. It likely means that Weezing doesn't get an attack in at all. We do risk missing Weezing 1, and Weezing 4 and 3 could get multiple focus bands. However, this is the most we can possibly do to try and prevent Weezing from using a move. Weezing is actually the much more threatening Pokemon here. Another upside of this play is that if we Thunderbolt with Gyarados and Raikou, then we're not using an inaccurate move like a Hydro Pump. When the final Pokemon is in, we can then make a judgment call on what is best to use after that. And of course, if this is Weezing 3, we're quite likely to hit the Pokemon in the back with Thunderbolt anyway. After quite a bit of deliberation, this is what LRXC ends up going for, with the Thunderbolt instead of Weezing. The fact that Weezing feints from this Thunderbolt means it must have been Weezing 3, which is good information because Weezing 3 is a high risk Pokemon, and this means that Entei can't be high risk, which means it's not Entei 3, and the Pokemon in the back also can't be a high risk Pokemon. It's also good news because it means Gyarados' Thunderbolt is going to hit whatever's in the back. It is actually revealed to be Latios in the back, which is one of the worst matchups for this team. Thunderbolt hits and does quite good damage to this Latios. This means that Latios is very unlikely to have any kind of bulk, because the Latios sets without bulk will run max special attack and max attack. A lot of these sets obviously have the move Thunderbolt. Raikou and Gyarados are both faster than every Latios set except Latios 8, and so it's quite likely they're going to get 2 attacks in. This is a much more complicated scenario though, even after Entei has used Double Team. It's actually a bit less likely to be Latios 8. The reason for this is that Latios 8 has the item King's Rock, and this must be Entei 1 or Entei 4. And because Entei 4 has the item King's Rock, and the item clause does apply to the opponent's team, it is slightly less likely to be Latios A tier. The real question then becomes whether or not this is Latios 2 with Thunderbolt or Latios 6 with Thunder Wave. Both of these Pokemon are going to want to use the electric move into Gyarados. The plan on what to do in this 3 vs 2 situation is a little bit complicated, but I think the most important insight is the fact that Raikou does beat Entei one-on-one with Calm Mind. LRXC would have to get very unlucky for Raikou to lose this 1v1, and it would probably involve being crit at least once. What's much more important is to remove Latios. However, even if it is Latios 2, like we said earlier, it can't actually Earthquake next to Entei, as Entei is seen as weak to Earthquake. This means that if Raikou uses Calm Mind, it probably has quite a lot of time to beat Latios 2. While Latios 6 does have Luster Purge, this still makes Calm Mind a pretty good move to use on Raikou. The real question then becomes what to do with Gyarados. While we could switch out, it's unlikely that Raikou and Armaldo together are going to kill Latios fast enough, and if it is a Thunderbolt Latios, this might mean that Gyarados is doomed to die. Therefore, the best thing to do with Gyarados might just be to immediately target Entei with Hydro Pump. The upside of this is obvious. We're using Hydro Pump before Entei has got too many boosts, and before it potentially uses Calm Mind, which would let it survive the Hydro Pump. Against an evasion boosted Entei, Hydro Pump is of course quite inaccurate, however this is probably Gyarados' best chance to actually do something in the match. I will also say that this scenario does punch some holes into how good Armaldo 1 actually is. The fact that Armaldo 1 can't one-shot Entei, and Armaldo 1 does not do good damage into Latios is quite a big blow for how viable it is. It's therefore likely, as LRXC is saying in commentary at the time, that Armaldo is likely to be swapped out for Latios after this match, even though this Latios is a free IV set, and Armaldo is 31 IVs. So LRXC does go for the Calm Mind and Hydro Pump into the Entei. Calm Mind comes through, and Entei uses Double Team. This makes Hydro Pump 48% accurate into Entei. Gyarados does hit this Hydro Pump. This wasn't necessary to win, but it is a good break of luck. It's very unlikely that Latios could ever win a 3v1 situation here. Latios actually goes for Thunder Wave. This reveals that it must be Latios 6. Latios 6 definitely isn't the best doubles Latios set, however it is a serious upgrade over Armaldo, which is a Pokemon that is struggling a lot here. In terms of what to do here, it's actually quite important to attack as soon as possible. Attacking has several upsides. Not only can we crit Latios, but also we can get secondary effects like paralysis. We just want to do damage to it to make sure that Armaldo can potentially finish it off. The only way that Latios would ever win here is through extreme T-Wave luck, and before we get T-Waved we want to get the damage in. The Thunder Waves don't come through though, and Latios goes down. That's now a win streak of 176. The second match comes up, and the hint this time is that there is no type specialty, and the phrase is going to be high risk, high return. High risk, high return is probably the most common phrase after the no phrase hint. In terms of swaps, it could actually be a serious consideration to take Entei here. Fire types are quite a lot better in doubles due to the nerf surf damage, and the fact that Earthquake has this weird AI. However, it's probably a bad idea to go double Ground Weak in a draft like this, and Raikou is almost definitely staying on the team. All this means that it's incredibly likely that Latios 6 is coming in over Armaldo. Latios 6 in many ways is almost a direct upgrade to Armaldo. It has better typing, it has better speed, and it hits harder. Thunder Wave is also incredible support. The one downside is that we're losing access to Protect. However, the fact that Latios can switch into Earthquakes aimed at Raikou, and it can also switch into Thunderbolts aimed at Gyarados, is a huge benefit here. So LRXC ends up swapping for Latios, and we go into the second match of the round. And he ends up sending out Shuckle and Claydol. Because this is a high risk, high return game, it's incredibly likely this is Claydol 4, because Claydol 4 is the only Pokemon with a high risk move in Explosion. If it's not Claydol 4, the Pokemon in the back must have at least 2 high risk moves. In terms of Shuckle, we don't know very much about Shuckle at this point. There's a bit more complicated factors we could do, such as the fact that this can't be Claydol 3 and Shuckle 2, because both of those have a weather move, and that would trigger the weather phrase, and because we know it's the high risk, high return, it can't be the weather phrase instead. Although a bit of thought should be spared for the fact that it might not be Claydol 4, really the main plan should be against Claydol 4. Claydol 4 is in a bit of a weird situation here. Because Shuckle is a rock type, Claydol cannot use the move Earthquake. Obviously, Rock and Bug together are actually neutral to Earthquake, but the check that the AI does is very simple. It just checks if Shuckle is a rock type, and that is confirmed to be true, and therefore it can't use Earthquake. This is quite a serious consequence because it means that Explosion is quite a lot more likely from Claydol than usual. Explosion would be a big risk because even after Intimidate, it is possible that Raikou and Gyarados both faint to Explosion, and obviously Shuckle can live Explosion. While Shuckle is pretty terrible in doubles because of how passive it is, there is a small risk here. If Shuckle is allowed to get too many double team boosts up, it is possible that Shuckle could actually run away with the game, particularly if Raikou faints, and Raikou is a lot more likely to faint to Explosion than Gyarados is. It is possible to bring Latios in here, however Latios is only going to do about half damage to Claydol with the move Shadow Ball. And obviously the biggest problem here is the simple fact that Raikou cannot touch Claydol at all with any of its moves. There's also a bit more information we can get out of the enemy team. While the enemy has no type specialty, it is possible that the Pokemon in the back could be a rock ground type like Rhydon. That would mean the enemy team has 2 ground types, but it also has 2 rock types. Because these 2 types would then tie, there would actually be no type specialty like we see here. This is quite unfortunate because it means that actually saving Raikou might not be an amazing idea. We could be pinned quite badly again if Rhydon comes out or a similar Pokemon like Golem. In the first match we criticised the most obvious play, but actually in this match I would say the most obvious play is definitely correct. And the most obvious play here is definitely to switch out Raikou so it can be used later on, bring in Latios in the Raikou slot, and then Gyarados needs to use Hydro Pump against Claydol. Hydro Pump is probably not going to kill Claydol 4, but it will do a lot of damage, and it will definitely mean that Latios could finish off Claydol. Claydol could explode of course and kill Gyarados and Latios on the first turn, however Raikou in a 1v2 scenario isn't too bad. So long as the other Pokemon can be taken down by Thunderbolt, because Shuckle is so passive, Raikou can simply ignore Shuckle and focus on the 1v1 with the other Pokemon. Then, when that faints, we can use Rest and Calm Mind and make sure we take down Shuckle as well. This is our underrated part of high-level factory gameplay, which is the understanding that sometimes the obvious move is the best idea. LRXC ends up switching to Latios and using Hydro Pump against Claydol like we said. Hydro Pump comes in and does hit. That's a very important hit as we know that we need the extra damage into Claydol 4. Claydol actually ends up using Rock Slide though. This is pretty unlikely, but it means that this must be Claydol 1. In the meantime, Shuckle uses Sandstorm, revealing it's Shuckle 2. Shuckle 2 is a terrible set and can be ignored. The only problem is that it might use Flash against some of our Pokemon. While Claydol 1 is a lucky break, it does mean that we know for certain that the final Pokemon has to have a double high risk move in the back. This turn might seem pretty obvious in the fact that Gyarados wants to hit Claydol and Latios also wants to hit Claydol because Gyarados could miss and Gyarados can't use the move Thunderbolt against Claydol. However, the real consideration here is what move Latios should actually click at all. We could use Lussapurge, Shadow Ball or Dragon Claw. These are all valid attacks that would kill Claydol. However, it's likely that the Pokemon in the back is going to switch in after Gyarados hits it, and therefore we want to think about what the most damage we can possibly do to the Pokemon in the back is, factors in against what our team is. First up, Shadow Ball isn't a very good idea. Because Claydol is a Psychic type, there are actually no possible Psychic Pokemon that could be in the back that would lead to a tie in terms of the type specialty, so we aren't going to be hitting a Psychic type with Shadow Ball. It could be a Ghost type, however Ghost is a fairly rare type in the factory, and also we're not too worried about the Ghost types that could appear, as most of them will lose to Raikou. The real question then becomes if we want to use Lussapurge or Dragon Claw. Of these two moves, I would say Dragon Claw is probably best. It has the higher base power, and it has fewer resistances. It is true that a Steel type could switch in, however even if it is something like Registeel, we're probably in quite a good scenario. Probably the worst thing that could switch in and resist Dragon Claw could be a Quick Claw Scizor. Now I couldn't watch all this stream, but I was there for this game, and something I suggested in chat, and LRXC also went for, was another idea. Instead of double targeting the Claydol, we can actually switch Gyarados out. Gyarados is already forced to use an inaccurate move into Claydol, and most of the high risk, high return Pokemon are going to be physical types with moves like Double Edge. Switching Gyarados out here means that we can switch it back in later and use Intimidate again, and Latios doesn't need any help to kill Claydol. And the fact that Shuckle is incredibly passive actually gives us time to do this. So I would say clearly the best idea here is to bring Gyarados out so we can Intimidate later and use Shadow Ball on Claydol. The final Pokemon is Miltank. And because we know this must be a double high risk Miltank, it has to be Miltank 1. Miltank 1 is a weird Pokemon with no speed, no attack investment and Milk Drink. And because Shuckle doesn't have a move like Toxic, we are safe to just double focus down Miltank here. Miltank does go down as Shuckle uses Double Team. As I said earlier, if we didn't have a boosting move, there is a small risk that Shuckle could run away this game with enough dodges. However, at +3, Raikou is actually guaranteed to kill Shuckle, so there's almost no risk here unless every single Thunderbolt misses Shuckle, which is very unlikely to happen. Shuckle does end up using Flash on Raikou, however one weird quirk of Pokemon is that if you have evasion and accuracy drops, they can't stack to more than a +6 effective difference. This means that even if you have -6 accuracy against a +6 evasion enemy, it's still going to behave as if you had 0 accuracy and they had +6 evasion. And Raikou actually hits the first Thunderbolt immediately, which ends the game. That brings the streak to 177, but there's still 5 matches left in the round. The next match, once again, is a no-type specialty with high risk, high return as the phrase hint. Although Claydol 1 can be quite a fun Pokemon with the Ivy advantage, we've got to remember that with the Ivy disadvantage, this is just a Claydol. We could consider putting it onto the team, as it can Earthquake next to either Gyarados or Latios. However, this would be a major downgrade in terms of speed. We also can't really take Miltank 1 as it's way too passive in doubles, and Shuckle 2 is even worse in terms of how passive it is in doubles. So the next match begins and out comes Regirock and Glalie. This is actually a nightmare scenario for the team. Because it's high risk, both of these Pokemon are quite likely to have Explosion, and we know from previous games that Explosion is one of the things we're most afraid of. In most normal scenarios, we'd be double targeting both of these Pokemon down. Fire Blast on its own is not guaranteed to take down Glalie, so Raikou would have to assist in that kill, and Hydro Pump is also not guaranteed to take down Regirock, so Raikou would also have to assist in that kill. However, we can obviously only double target one of these Pokemon. It's hard to say which one is deadlier. One factor here is that Glalie 1 is actually incredibly likely to use Protect on turn 1. If Glalie 1 uses Protect and we whiff both moves into Protect and we give Regirock a free turn, that could be a disaster. Regirock itself is actually quite likely to waste the first turn of the match, either on Curse or a move like Rock Slide or Earthquake, which Raikou is going to survive. However, because Regirock is clear body, we haven't actually intimidated it, and this means that Regirock does do more damage on average. We also are much more afraid of the Regirock Explosion, as it's guaranteed to kill both Raikou and Gyarados, whereas the Glalie Explosion is a move that both Pokemon could live. Because Regirock isn't actually strong enough to kill Raikou with Earthquake, none of its sets are ever actually going to use that move, and that does make Explosion even more likely. Leaving Glalie up for a turn isn't great. One of the worst things that Glalie can do is actually use Icy Wind against both Pokemon, dropping our speed, and then the final Pokemon out on the enemy team could be something very deadly that we would need speed for. There's also the obvious risk of freeze from either Ice Beam or Blizzard. At least with Explosion this time, unlike when Armaldo was on the team, it would likely be a 1v1 with Latios into the final enemy Pokemon. While Regirock would survive Glalie's Explosion, if we target Regirock down, it is going to faint to the Explosion after that damage. And this is another reason to target Regirock instead of Glalie. The main reason we might want to target Glalie instead of Regirock is that if we kill Glalie and Regirock explodes, we almost certainly win, as the final Pokemon on the enemy team probably would faint to the Regirock Explosion. However, this is a much riskier line, and you're only going to get close to 200 wins if you avoid this kind of risk. In the end, LRXC does go for the Thunderbolt and Hydro Pump into the Regirock. The Thunderbolt damage reveals that that must have been a special defense boosted Regirock, which likely means it's Regirock 3 or 6. There's a small chance it could be 4 as well, however 4 would probably take a bit more damage. In comes Hariyama as Glalie uses Icy Wind. This was a move that we were afraid of, however Hariyama is actually too slow to take advantage of the speed drop. This isn't great though, it does mean that Glalie is now faster than both Raikou and Gyarados, and because Glalie is faster, it's no longer going to want to use the move Icy Wind, it's either going to Body Slam or Explode. A fast explosion here could be devastating, because Latios is actually slower than Glalie naturally. We do know a bit of information about this Hariyama. Because this was high risk, and it wasn't guaranteed that that was Regirock 6, it probably is a high risk Hariyama, and that's Hariyama 1 or Hariyama 3. This actually introduces a new risk to the scenario. Hariyama might be using Fake Out here into either Raikou or Gyarados, and we wouldn't actually know which one it chooses. The scariest thing about this though is the fact that Glalie is faster than every single Pokemon on our team after this Icy Wind. It is very tempting to switch out either Raikou or Gyarados to make sure that if they switch in later, at least they're going to be faster than Glalie. There's also a lot of risk of dealing damage to Glalie here. The more damage we deal to Glalie, the more likely it becomes to explode, and obviously if it outspeeds and explodes first, that could easily be the end of the game if they fake out a single Pokemon. This combination of wanting to be faster than the Glalie and also being scared about the fake out and also not wanting to deal too much damage to Glalie means it is clearly best to actually switch out one of our Pokemon here. It is arguable once again which Pokemon we want to switch out. If we switch out Raikou, we have a very accurate Thunderbolt to use later on when we outspeed. If we switch out Gyarados, we get to have another Intimidate as Gyarados switches in later on. Overall, I actually like the lower variance play of bringing out Raikou, making sure that we've got the accurate Thunderbolt later on in the game. And LRXC actually agrees with this. The question then becomes what Gyarados does on this turn. There are a lot of things to consider here. We might want to attack Glalie, but even if we use a weaker move, we might end up critting it, and we don't want that to happen. We don't really want to paralyze or burn Hariyama from Thunderbolt or Fire Blast secondary effect because it could have the ability Guts. However, probably worse than this would be missing. LRXC ends up going for the Thunderbolt to make sure we don't miss Hariyama. This damage could be very important as it makes sure that Latios' Luster Purge is always going to kill bulkier Hariyama sets. We know that this isn't Fake Out Hariyama 1. Hariyama actually ends up going for the Earthquake, which is obviously a kill move it tried to use on Raikou. This is another bonus to switching Raikou out. Obviously Raikou then dodges this move, and Glalie gets hit by that Earthquake. While it might look like we're quite far ahead here, there's actually a fairly big risk involved. Hariyama could activate its Quick Claw and get a Rock Slide flinch into either Latios or Gyarados or both. On top of this, it could actually crit Gyarados. The risk then would become whether or not Glalie uses the move Explosion. If Gyarados faints to a Quick Claw crit Rock Slide and then Glalie explodes, every Pokemon on the field could faint, and the draw in the Battle Factory is treated the same as a loss in terms of the win streak. However, this is obviously an incredibly unlikely scenario, and switching Raikou in would be a major mistake, as Raikou is one cross-chop crit away from dying, and Harima could use cross-chop on either Latios or Gyarados here. In terms of what to do, if Harima faints, it's actually game over, because we know that if Raikou comes in later, it can easily use Thunderbolt on this Glalie and kill it. So we just want to kill Harima because it has the item Quick Claw. Luster Purge will likely do this, and LRXC actually goes to the Hydro Pump on Gyarados because Hydro Pump might kill, and Latios could be put out of action by a flinch from Quick Claw Harima, or from a Body Slam paralysis into full paralysis from Glalie. While Glalie does use Body Slam into Latios, this doesn't end up happening, and Latios gets a Luster Purge off into Harima, killing it. This looked like a dominant win, but we have to remember how badly wrong it could have gone on the early turns if Explosion had happened, or if Regirock had dodged one of those moves, particularly if Regirock had dodged Hydro Pump. The next hint ends up being No Type again, and High Risk High Return again. Obviously, High Risk High Return is a fairly common phrase in the Battle Factory. LRXC has a very good team, and he does turn down a swap opportunity. However, I will say it's possible to consider switching out Raikou here. If we switch out Raikou, we're no longer as worried about the Thunderbolt lock into enemy ground types or enemy Pokemon with Volt Absorb. The next match begin and Gardevoir and Electabuzz come out. Now because it's high risk high return, once again we do have a bit of information here. The move Destiny Bond is considered a high risk high return move, and the move Focus Punch is also considered a high risk high return move. This makes Electabuzz 4 fairly likely, and it also means that it's very likely this Gardevoir has Destiny Bond in its moveset. This is obviously a pretty bad pin for Gyarados. Electabuzz 3 does outspeed Gyarados, and Thunderbolt will kill, and obviously Raikou isn't going to be able to save Gyarados from Electabuzz. On top of this, Gardevoir could also easily have the move Thunderbolt. So the big temptation here is going to be to switch out Gyarados into Latios. Once Latios is in, it can either kill Electabuzz or Gardevoir depending on what Raikou chooses to target on turn 1. A Thunderbolt from Raikou combined with a Dragon Claw from Latios will kill Electabuzz, and the same is true on Gardevoir if Latios is going to use the move Shadow Ball. One downside of this plan is that Latios is slower than both Electabuzz 2 and Electabuzz 3, and several of the Gardevoir sets as well, so Latios is not guaranteed to actually get this move off. And the problem with that is fairly simple, which is that Raikou is not going to two-shot Electabuzz with Thunderbolt. This means that if Electabuzz or Gardevoir is faster than Latios, Latios might faint and Gyarados might be forced back in before Electabuzz or Gardevoir have actually fainted at all. For this reason, which is because Latios might be slower than both enemy Pokemon, it's probably best that Raikou targets Gardevoir. We could go for a Calm Mind, however even at +1 we're not guaranteed to kill a lot of the Gardevoir sets, and the bulkier Gardevoir sets are definitely going to live a +1 Thunderbolt. And since 2 Thunderbolt do more damage than a Calm Mind Thunderbolt, this is definitely the best course of action. We also have the upside of potentially getting a crit. Raikou uses Thunderbolt onto Gardevoir, and Gardevoir is revealed to not be that bulky. Electabuzz ends up actually using the move Thunder, which reveals Electabuzz 2. And Gardevoir uses Double Team, which reveals that it is indeed one of the less bulky Gardevoir sets, most likely Gardevoir 8. Now there is a bit of a question on what to do here. On one hand we could try and finish off Gardevoir, on the other hand we could try and kill Electabuzz. Anyone who's seen my video on the weather bug in Generation 3 would actually know here that Electabuzz 2 is guaranteed to use Rain Dance here. This is because Electabuzz 2 is faster than Latios, and Rain Dance is therefore guaranteed to get a +1 score, and Electabuzz doesn't see any kind of kill on any other Pokemon. Because we know that Electabuzz is going to waste this turn, it's quite a big opportunity here. We can use Thunderbolt onto Gardevoir and Dragon Claw the Gardevoir slot as well, hitting the Pokemon in the back before it gets a single chance to use a move. We're not that worried about Electabuzz 2, because Electabuzz 2 is easily dominated by both Raikou and Latios in the endgame. It is true that this might sacrifice Gyarados, however it's probably fine. And Magmar comes out. Magmar is not much of a surprise as we know that the final Pokemon had to be high risk high return, and Magmar 3 does have the move Counter, which is considered high risk high return. Latios hits Magmar 3 very hard, and at this point the game is completely over. Magmar 3 is obviously slower than both Raikou and Latios, and it can't avoid dying. Magmar 3 is too slow to avoid death here, and it doesn't have any kind of hacks item like Focus Band or Bright Powder, so it's guaranteed to go down next turn. The question then becomes what's the safest way of dealing with Electabuzz, and actually, Electabuzz has a bigger chance to win here than Magmar, because the move Thunder could paralyze Raikou and Latios and then force them to fail all their moves. For this reason, the smartest thing to do here is actually to target down the Electabuzz. It's going to feint the Thunderbolt and Luster Purge together, and this avoids having to make contact into static with Latios. This means that Magmar 3 will survive the turn, however Magmar 3 has absolutely no chance of winning this game in a 1v3 scenario. These little optimizations like killing Electabuzz before Magmar might seem quite minor, but they're fairly important in a 200 win streak. Obviously one way to view a 200 win streak is that your worst possible lock is going to be around the 0.5 percentile range, which translates to multiple crits or multiple fully paralyzed turns. If you don't try and avoid this kind of luck actively, you're definitely going to lose way earlier than this. We finally actually get a type spec. It's revealed to be a water type spec with no phrase. In general, water should be very good news. Raikou is obviously very good into most water types. As I said at the start of the video, Gyarados is a water type that is good against other water types because of its Thunderbolt as well. And Latios does quite well into water types. One thing that Latios has to be pretty careful of is the fact that a lot of water types in the factory do run the move Ice Beam. While Latios will obviously survive a non-stab Ice Beam, it can freeze and it can crit. What is particularly scary about the water type phrase though, is not actually the direct water types like Starmie, which we're going to handle quite easily, but instead Swampert and Quagsire. These are going to be big problems because they can't be hit by Raikou, and while they can be hit by Hydro Pump is fairly inaccurate, and Gyarados might be alone in trying to target them. On top of this, Swampert can be a nightmare because of Mirror Coat. We do know that it's not going to be Swampert 2, because Swampert 2 on its own activates High Risk High Reward, and this is not a High Risk High Reward trainer. However, the other Swampert sets are definitely up for grabs. Another slightly scary thing about water is going to be the very bulky water types with Oko moves. Probably due to an oversight, the move Sheer Cold is not considered high risk high return, even though the other Oko moves are. While Raikou should be able to handle most of these, it's not guaranteed that Raikou is going to survive the entire game, and they could come in later. Despite all of that, there's not a great swap opportunity. Electabuzz 2 might seem tempting, but Electabuzz 2 has to rely on hitting Thunders, which can be very shaky, and Electabuzz 2 would make our team even worse into Swampert and Quagsire. It's actually Ludicolo and Quagsire. This is a really brutal opening matchup. The problem here is fairly simple. Ludicolo could easily have to move Thunder Punch, which is a big problem for Gyarados, even though Gyarados would survive, and Quagsire could have to move Earthquake. Now, because of Intimidate, it's not actually going to use Earthquake on the first turn. However, as soon as Raikou takes a bit of damage, or as soon as Quagsire 3 uses Curse, it can then use Earthquake. The fact that this is no phrase doesn't mean a lot here. It's slightly less likely to be Ludicolo 4 because Ludicolo 4 has Leech Seed and Toxic, which almost activates Slow and Steady. However, it is still possible that this could be Ludicolo 4. This is obviously a very dangerous opening matchup. There's pressure on Raikou and Gyarados both wanting to switch out early, and because we don't know the Quagsire or the Ludicolo set yet, it's hard to say which one is more important to save. This wouldn't be such a bad scenario if Thunderbolt and Fire Blast together always killed Ludicolo 1 and 2, however they're definitely not guaranteed to do that. This puts Raikou in a very awkward position. Probably the most obvious thing to do after potentially switching Raikou out is to Calm Mind with Raikou and Thunderbolt Ludicolo. This would mean that Raikou could then kill Ludicolo the next turn with Thunderbolt, and potentially still have +1 for the Pokemon in the back. While it might seem risky to do this, we've got to remember that Quagsire is intimidated and therefore at -1 attack and therefore cannot use Earthquake. However, there is a fairly big drawback to this. If Quagsire 3 uses Curse on turn 1, which is incredibly likely, we're probably going to have to switch Raikou out unless we want it to faint. Probably this means the best idea for Raikou on turn 1 is to Thunderbolt Ludicolo anyway before any kind of attack boosts. This would give us the flexibility to swap Gyarados out, however we've got to be fairly careful about Quagsire. The problem with bringing Gyarados out is this could be Quagsire 4, which has Amnesia and is very likely to use it on turn 1. After Amnesia, Latios is not going to do much damage to it at all, and Latios is also going to be under threat from Ice Beam almost immediately. This is an example of a typical extremely complicated doubles factory turn. I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of it, but I just want you to appreciate how many possible combinations could exist between Ludicolo and Quagsire together, and how many possible moves there we could do on turn 1. In the end, LRXC does go for the Thunderbolt and the switch into Latios, which is probably the best idea as long as this is not Quagsire 4. Ludicolo ends up taking a lot of damage, which reveals that it is Ludicolo 1 or 2, and then it uses Thunder Punch into Latios. Unfortunately, Latios does get paralysed by this, which is a fairly huge problem for Latios. Quagsire then does unfortunately reveal the move Amnesia. This is suddenly a really bad scenario. Quagsire is obviously at +2 special defense. All the Pokemon on our team are special attackers apart from Latios with the move Shadow Ball, which obviously doesn't do much damage, and Quagsire 4 also has the item Leftovers, so our damage into it isn't going to be permanent. We'd probably still be okay, but Latios being paralysed on turn 1 is a fairly big problem. It's difficult to say what the best idea is. On one hand, we can try and isolate Quagsire by attacking both Ludicolo and whatever is behind Ludicolo in the back and killing those Pokemon as fast as possible to leave us into a 2v1 or a 3v1 scenario into the enemy Quagsire. On the other hand, we might want to attack Quagsire right now before it gets any more Amnesia boosts, because it is still fairly likely to use more Amnesias. If Raikou could touch Quagsire, this might be a better idea. However, because Raikou cannot touch Quagsire at all, it's probably just best that we target Ludicolo and hit whatever the Pokemon in the back is with a Dragon Claw from Latios. Or at least, hope we do and hope Latios doesn't get paralysed in the process. Latios was unfortunately the best Pokemon we had into this Quagsire, and it being damaged a bit and paralysed is quite a big problem. This much damage into Latios means that Quagsire's Ice Beam is now going to two-shot it, whereas if Latios was at full health, Latios would be safe from 2 Ice Beams. LRXC actually goes for a slightly different play than this, however. Because Latios is paralysed, LRXC actually decides to bring Gyarados back into the Latios slot. This means that Quagsire gets intimidated again, which is a big deal for how much damage Earthquake is doing into Raikou. In the meantime, Raikou can still kill Ludicolo, and because Raikou and Gyarados are going to be out together against the final two Pokemon, it means that Raikou and Gyarados can team up against the final Pokemon, and we don't have to worry about the final Pokemon being faster than a paralysed Latios. Overall, I would say this is actually a very strong play from LRXC. It's very heads up to think about having Gyarados proactively in before the final Pokemon comes out, to make sure that we can deal with it fast and leave Quagsire isolated. So Thunderbolt comes in and Ludicolo goes down, and the final Pokemon in is actually a Feraligatr. So this Water Specialist trainer actually had 3 Water types, not just 2. Quagsire unfortunately goes for the next Amnesia. This is the thing we didn't want to see. We wanted Quagsire to try and use Ice Beam into Latios. Now that Quagsire is at +4 special defense, and with Latios paralysed, Quagsire is definitely going to be a massive problem for this team. We don't know much about this Feraligatr. Obviously there was no phrasing, but that doesn't really mean a lot for the Feraligatr sets. Raikou is guaranteed to kill every single Feraligatr except for Feraligatr 2, which has a small chance to live. This is made slightly worse by the fact that Feraligatr 2 is also the Quick Claw set. The one upside of this should be that Feraligatr 2 really wants to use Scary Face, as the AI loves to have speed control in doubles. However, this actually reveals another bug with the Generation 3 AI. If Feraligatr is going to activate its Quick Claw, it actually already knows in advance that this will happen, and it doesn't see itself as being slower than the enemies. And this means that a Quick Claw activating Feraligatr is never going to use the move Scary Face. It's actually going to be guaranteed to attack. Because of this, it's actually a very big deliberation about exactly what to do with Feraligatr. I'm going to skip over it for this video, but I will say that it's very important to consider what move Gyarados is going to use, because Feraligatr 2 might survive the Thunderbolt. However, we also get our attack from Gyarados redirected into Quagsire if Feraligatr does die. LRXC goes for a decent mid-ground play here, which is to use Thunderbolt and Fire Blast. Fire Blast is going to finish off Feraligatr, it's the most accurate move that isn't Thunderbolt, and it's the most accurate move that's able to actually hit Quagsire. Fire Blast is a good move because if we can burn this Quagsire, the game is going to be over. Unfortunately, we do not get the burn, and Quagsire actually uses the final Amnesia. This is a really bad scenario. Why is it really bad? It's really bad because Ice Beam really threatens Latios, and Ice Beam also low-key threatens Gyarados as well. While a crit Hydro Pump can kill Quagsire, we've got to remember that Quagsire might have the ability Water Absorb, and then Hydro Pump's obviously going to do nothing. However, this is actually where the true depth of the factory rears its head. There's actually a very clever way of outsmarting the AI in this scenario. Let's loop back into the idea of Earthquake. So Earthquake is obviously the strongest move against Raikou. It's going to do the most damage. However, even in this scenario, Quagsire still thinks that its teammate is actually alive. It still actually sees Feraligatr as being on the field, but at 0 HP. Because Feraligatr's ghost is there, it's not going to want to use Earthquake unless Earthquake is definitely going to kill Raikou. And obviously at -2 attack, Earthquake does not kill Raikou. So Quagsire can't use Earthquake into Raikou, and it also can't use Surf or Ice Beam, because Surf and Ice Beam do less damage than Earthquake into Raikou, so these moves also get put at a -1 score in the AI. What does this mean? It means that Quagsire can only actually do one thing in this scenario. Quagsire has to use Ice Beam into Gyarados. This should be good news, however the problem is that Gyarados is going to faint to 5 or 6 Ice Beams. There's no way around this even with the Shell Bell healing. And after 5 or 6 Ice Beams, Gyarados is going to faint, Latios is going to come in, and then also faint to Ice Beam, and at that point Quagsire is easily going to beat Raikou. So if we stay in here, we're basically guaranteed to lose. But we can do something slightly different than staying in. Now hearing all of that, it maybe gives you an idea. Perhaps we should switch Gyarados out. The problem with that is that Latios also does not want to get hit by Ice Beam obviously. We're taking too much damage on Latios. So what is the actual solution here? The actual solution is to bring Latios into the Raikou slot, while Gyarados stays in and uses Fire Blast against Quagsire trying to get the burn. First up, if we burn Quagsire, we obviously win the game. If we don't burn Quagsire, we have a new interesting scenario here, because Latios and Gyarados are both going to be on the field, and Raikou has the ability to switch in. Quagsire wants to use the move Ice Beam against both Gyarados and Latios. After it hits Latios once with Ice Beam, it's actually guaranteed to go for it again. However, Raikou can be switching into this slot, and because Raikou has the ability Pressure, we're actually sapping Ice Beam with its PP way too quickly for Quagsire to keep up. If we can do this enough times to Quagsire, we're actually going to stall it out of all of its Ice Beam PP before it's able to kill a single one of our Pokemon. And at that point, we can actually stall it out of Earthquakes as well, and eventually win the struggle war with Raikou. Now this strategy isn't without zero risk. If Ice Beam crits Latios on the first attempt, this might be game over. However, if it does not, we're likely to be in a very favourable position to win the game. The earlier Thunder Punch that hit Latios, while seeming like a bad idea at the time, might actually be the reason that LRXC is able to win this game. Because we took more damage and we're going to feint to 2 Ice Beams. And if Quagsire sees a kill with Ice Beam into Latios, but does not see a kill with Ice Beam into Gyarados, it's actually guaranteed to go for Latios. And as we bring Latios in and out, we're never actually going to be any risk of switching into the Raikou slot, because like we said before, Quagsire is never going to attack Raikou, because it sees Earthquake as the strongest move, but it will refuse to use Earthquake because it is hallucinating that Earthquake is going to hit the ghost of its ally Pokemon Feraligatr. While that might sound rather simple, LRXC actually spends 40 minutes thinking about it because there's a lot of other things to consider, but like I said, the key insight here is the fact that Quagsire is never going to attack Raikou, it's always going to attack one of the other 2 with Ice Beam. And because Raikou has the ability Pressure, if Raikou switches into enough Ice Beams, it's going to sap enough PP out of Ice Beam until Quagsire cannot use the move anymore. After nearly 45 minutes of duration, LRXC eventually goes for this. We hit the Fire Blast, we do not burn, and then Ice Beam immediately freezes Gyarados. That's 1 Ice Beam used without a good result. The chance of us being able to burn Quagsire and easily win this game have gone down dramatically. What LRXC actually wants to do here is stay in with Latios. Again, we want Latios to be hit by Ice Beam so that we know we can always bring Raikou into that slot. In the meantime, the best thing to do with Gyarados is actually to bring Raikou into that slot now. This is because Quagsire is 50-50 to either Ice Beam Latios or Gyarados, as it doesn't see a kill on either Pokemon, and both Pokemon are most weak to the move Ice Beam. So LRXC goes to the Shadow Ball, and then switches out Raikou into the Gyarados slot, hoping that Quagsire is going to Ice Beam Raikou itself. Ice Beam does hit Raikou, which is a big result. That's 3 PP down on the move Ice Beam. However, LRXC also has to be very careful here with Raikou's HP. If we go too low, which is basically below about 40% HP, Quagsire is going to start to see a kill with Earthquake into Raikou, and at that point it's going to be guaranteed to use the move Earthquake. We don't want this to happen before we're done stalling the move Ice Beam. Luckily, of course, Raikou does have the move Rest, which we can use to heal up after being hit by a few Ice Beams. What follows after this is a massive 30-minute think. For this video, I'm skimming a bit over all of the details here, but what LRXC is basically doing is mapping out every single scenario for the next 10 to 20 turns to make sure he wins as often as possible with the best possible combination of switches. You don't have to understand it fully, but I do want you to appreciate just how much thought is going into this. We bring Latios out here. We bring Latios out here because, again, we want Raikou to be hit by Ice Beam instead of Latios. Once again, we've got to be careful about Gyarados' HP. If Gyarados gets too low on HP, Quagsire is going to see a guaranteed kill with Ice Beam into it, and we never want that to happen if Gyarados and Latios are both on the field at the same time. But the upside of having Gyarados out is we have more chances to try and unfreeze and use the move Fire Blast, which can win the game instantly if we burn the opponent. Quagsire goes for another Ice Beam into Gyarados. This is fairly brutal because it's only used up 5 PP in total, it's still got 5 Ice Beams left, and Gyarados and Latios could definitely both still feint the Ice Beams remaining, if we get perfectly unlucky on the Ice Beams being aimed at Gyarados or Latios instead of Raikou. However, on the other side, if a single Ice Beam hits Raikou and Quagsire does not crit a single Ice Beam, LRXC is actually guaranteed to win this game. And again, I want you to appreciate here that this is now a 2-hour match against his Water type opponent. Gyarados once again remains frozen solid, Quagsire once again picks the worst target for LRXC, which is the Gyarados. This is just really unlucky. We don't want Gyarados to get this low in HP, and Quagsire has won way too many of these 50-50s with Ice Beam. However, despite this, the fact that we're switching out in this way means that we still do have a good chance to win versus this Quagsire. It's just not going well in terms of the luck. Gyarados is going to survive the next Ice Beam, but if one more Ice Beam hits Gyarados, Quagsire is guaranteed to see the kill into the Gyarados slot. However, until this happens, we still want to stay in. Initially, this might seem like a problem, but remember what we said earlier. Ice Beam is guaranteed now to be used against Gyarados. And if we switch Gyarados out, this Ice Beam is guaranteed to hit Raikou. That means that Quagsire will only have 1 PP left after Ice Beam hits Raikou. This leaves one tiny thing to be afraid of, which is the fact that Latios might get crit by Ice Beam next turn. So we switch out and this Ice Beam hits Raikou. Quagsire only has 1 PP of Ice Beam left now. Latios actually hits a Shadow Ball into Quagsire. This isn't very important in terms of the damage we're dealing, but it is fairly important in terms of the Shell Bell healing. We now bring Gyarados in on the Latios slot, guaranteeing that Latios is going to survive even if Ice Beam crits here. Now at this point, the game is actually not over. An initial feeling is that Quagsire has 15 PP left on Surf. With 15 Surfs, Latios will feint. However, it is doubles, and Raikou has the ability Pressure. Because Surf also hits Raikou as well as Latios, Quagsire is only actually going to be able to use 8 Surfs here. It needs to crit almost every single Surf, and Latios needs to get fully paralysed almost every single turn to avoid any kind of Shell Bell healing for Latios to feint. If Latios doesn't feint the Surf, LRXC is actually eventually going to win this game. So Raikou wants to remain healthy. Again, Raikou's job is just to stay healthy so that pressure is being applied on Surf. The reason why we want to use Rest constantly is because we don't want Surf to crit Raikou and then for Quagsire to use Earthquake. So Raikou keeps building up the special defense boosts, which are fairly important to take less damage from Surf and to spend less time asleep. Latios hits for another paralysis, and Quagsire keeps spamming the move Surf. Again, Surf is the only move that Quagsire can use here. It can't use Earthquake at all. Latios does get a full paralyze, however Quagsire has not got enough crits with Surf to actually win the game from here. So more Surfs come through. Latios is doing very well in terms of hitting Shadow Ball. Shadow Ball does actually hit once again and Quagsire goes down. Quagsire was not guaranteed to faint there, however we would say that because Quagsire was about to run out of Surfs, LRXC was almost guaranteed to win from that position. Now I don't know how well I actually communicated that scenario versus Quagsire, however I would say that there are probably only 4 people in the entire world who'd be able to win from that position in doubles. It was incredibly complicated endgame and it was incredibly important to play that properly. If you just stay in and attack with Gyarados in that initial position, you're almost guaranteed to lose to the Quagsire, because it's just going to run through the team with Ice Beam. That required perfect AI knowledge to understand when Quagsire was and wasn't going to use Earthquake, and what it was and wasn't going to target in terms of its partner. That also reveals one of the biggest bugs with Generation 3, which is the fact that the Quagsire still saw the Feraligatr as alive, and was therefore unable to use Earthquake against Raikou. So that game lasted almost 2 hours, and it's easy to forget that the match actually started off with a Ludicolo. I would say that Ludicolo 2 pickup is actually quite tempting here. Once again, if it was me, I'd be quite tempted to try and get rid of the Raikou. The reason LRXC almost lost that last game is because Raikou only has Thunderbolt as a coverage move. However, like I said at the start of the video, there are pros and cons to this. The fact that Raikou can immediately kill something with Thunderbolt on turn 1 is a big upside to how this team functions. In the end, LRXC does decide to stick with the team. This next match is actually a grass type specialist, which is a fairly rare type in the factory. Most of the grass types in the factory are really bad. The one thing that does stand out though is Sceptile. Sceptile is very fast and has Thunder Punch for Gyarados. It also has very strong Leaf Blades and it has Crunch and Dragon Claw for Latios as well. So LRXC is basically hoping that Sceptile does not come out, but Sceptile obviously immediately does come out on turn 1. Sceptile Vaporeon isn't a bad lead duo though. Vaporeon is a much scarier Pokemon in singles than it is in doubles. Again, Vaporeon is nerfed pretty badly by the fact that Surf has nerf spread damage. Because the move hint was no phrase, we don't actually have very much information about which Vaporeon and which Sceptile this is. It could be any of them. Vaporeon will obviously survive the Raikou Thunderbolt, however it will never survive Raikou Thunderbolt and Gyarados Thunderbolt together. The risk with doing that though is obviously in the time that we're trying to do that, Sceptile could easily use Thunder Punch into Gyarados. It may be a bit tempting to switch Gyarados out here, but unfortunately Raikou does not two-shot Sceptile with a Thunderbolt. And on top of this, Sceptile could also be Sceptile 1, and Sceptile 1 is guaranteed to use the move Detect on turn 1. This actually means there's only one good Sceptile set in terms of staying in, which is Sceptile 3. Every other Sceptile set is either going to use Detect or use Thunder Punch. And there's actually another problem with switching out Gyarados, which is that Vaporeon could easily use Ice Beam into the Gyarados slot, and if Ice Beam gets redirected into Latios, Latios is taking heavy damage from an Ice Beam. Despite this, it's probably the best plan to try and get rid of Vaporeon. Again, we know that there's a Grass type in the back. I actually quite like staying in with Gyarados here, and accepting that Gyarados isn't going to do much this game. However, LRXC does go for the switch. Raikou goes to the Calm Mind to make sure that the +1 Thunderbolt is going to kill Vaporeon, and Sceptile goes to Leaf Blade. And then Vaporeon goes to Bite, which reveals that it's Vaporeon 1. It is of course fairly lucky that Vaporeon did not use Ice Beam there. Because Sceptile will use Leaf Blade against Gyarados, we can actually be fairly sure that this is most likely Sceptile 3. However, while I said earlier that the Thunder Punch Sceptile sets are going to use Thunder Punch against Gyarados, because Thunder Punch is a roll against Gyarados and because Leaf Blade is a high crit move, it is possible, although very unlikely, that this could still be Sceptile 2 or Sceptile 4. And this is fairly important in this scenario, because Latios is at 49 HP, it's going to live a Sceptile 3 Crush Claw, but of course it will never live a Sceptile 4 Dragon Claw or Crunch. Latios would really like to stay in and hit Sceptile here while Raikou targets Vaporeon, however there is a bit of risk here. Overall I'd say that the chance that this is actually Sceptile 2 or 4 is so low that it's still probably correct to have Latios stay in on this turn. And it's probably best that Latios targets Sceptile, because that way Raikou can target Sceptile next turn, which is going to save Latios from fainting to Sceptile 3. So LRXC goes for the Thunderbolt into Vaporeon, Vaporeon goes down, and Vileplume comes out. Again, it had to be a Grass type in the back. Sceptile actually goes to Leaf Blade into Raikou, this of course guarantees that it's not Sceptile 4, and Latios hits the Dragon Claw into Sceptile. Sceptile is now going to feint the Thunderbolt no matter what if LRXC wants to target Sceptile over Vileplume. Of course we know almost nothing about this Vileplume because there's no phrase, but Raikou takes out Sceptile, and then Luster Purge hits Vileplume, taking it out. The fact that Luster Purge killed there without a crit means that it was almost certainly Vileplume 3 or Vileplume 4, as these do not run any bulk. So now it's the final match of the round. LRXC's team will disappear after this, so we can fully try and counter the next hint. It's no type and then high risk, high return once more. Now while Vaporeon 1 is a very good Pokemon in singles, in doubles I think it's a lot harder to justify because of the nerf spread damage to Surf. Sceptile 3 is a Pokemon that divides a lot of the community. I actually think it's very good. I'm not sure I put it on this team though. I think Latios 6 is still better than Sceptile 3. However, I'd be willing to be wrong about this, and the fact that Sceptile is so much faster than Latios could argue for a swap for it in this position. Sceptile of course also does similar things to Latios in terms of the fact that Sceptile can easily switch into a Thunderbolt, and Sceptile can also switch into an Earthquake. It's Sailor Peter, an outcome Lapras and Jolteon, and this is an absolutely terrifying opening matchup. There are several things that are really bad about this. First up, two Jolteon sets, Jolteon 1 and Jolteon 4, outspeed Raikou and Oko Gyarados. But far worse than this is the simple fact that Lapras is incredibly likely to be Lapras 7 or Lapras 8, which are both Oko sets. The reason for this, of course, is that Oko moves are high risk, high return, and we know this is a high risk, high return trainer. It might seem like Latios can easily switch into Gyarados here, but unfortunately, Jolteon 4 is pretty good against Latios as well. On top of this, obviously, Raikou cannot touch a Volt Absorb Jolteon, although Thunder Wave does work against Volt Absorb in Generation 3. The downside to using Thunder Wave though is it could be Jolteon 1 and cure the paralysis with its Cherry Berry anyway. LRXC spends a long time thinking about alternatives here, but the fact is, the Gyarados just cannot stay in against Jolteon. It is too much of a risk. And in the meantime, Raikou basically has no option. It has to target Lapras here. Calm Mind isn't a good option, because Thunderbolt has an upside of both being able to crit and being able to paralyze Lapras. While Lapras could be Shell Armor, and therefore it's more like a 3% crit, this is still a major upside into Lapras 7 and Lapras 8. In the meantime, LRXC just has to hope that this isn't Jolteon 4 specifically. If it's any of the other sets, he's probably fine. But there's no doubt that the true nightmare of Lapras 8 activating a Quick Claw and hitting an Oko move is something that LRXC could do nothing about here. Again, there is some truth to the fact that sometimes in Factory, your time is just up. If the game wants you to lose, you're going to lose. There's nothing you can do about a 6% Quick Claw Oko move right now. This is both a negative in terms of the Factory, as it can feel like it can be unfair, but on the other hand, these kind of RNG checks make sure that streaks don't last too long. LRXC actually ends up going for Calm Mind on Raikou, which is a choice I really don't like against Lapras. Again, if we use Thunderbolt against Lapras and it does Sheer Cold or Horn Drill Raikou, at least after we hit it with a Thunderbolt, we're able to kill it with another Pokemon. So Calm Mind comes through, Thunderbolt comes through, which was guaranteed from Jolteon. There's a small criticism I want to put here, which is that LRXC should be having the HP displayed as a raw number here. You can do this in Generation 3 by pressing Move Select. If he did this, he'd know Latios' exact HP, and because different Jolteon sets have different amount of power, we'd actually be able to work out a bit more about what Jolteon set it is. It is true that LRXC could check the HP of Latios at the end of the turn, however, if Lapras also hits Latios here, it won't be clear how much damage Jolteon did and how much damage Lapras did exactly. This is a small inaccuracy, and it's the kind of mistake that everyone does make, including me, of course. But Lapras reveals Dragon Dance, and this means it's Lapras free. Lapras free is obviously high risk as well because of Double Edge, but this is a massive let-off. Lapras free is far less deadly than Lapras 7 or Lapras 8. There's a slight downside in the fact that Lapras 3 does have a Bright Powder, which means that Raikou could miss Lapras. However, the upside here is that because Lapras is still slower after a Dragon Dance, it's going to use Dragon Dance again while at full health. So Raikou and Latios still have nothing to fear from this Lapras almost certainly. So Jolteon 2 and Jolteon 4 can both do 36 damage to Raikou. However, because Raikou was faster, this is actually guaranteed to be Jolteon 2. Jolteon 2 is a bit of a meme set, it's pretty bad. The one thing it does do very well in this game, obviously, is still kill Gyarados quite easy from full HP. Now I'm actually going to be very critical and nitpicky here. The most obvious thing to do on this turn is definitely to try and Thunderbolt Lapras to bring it down, and then either Dragon Claw Jolteon or Dragon Claw the Mon in the back, whatever it is. However, I actually think this is a serious mistake. Why is this a serious mistake? Well, we know that Jolteon 2 and Lapras 3 actually aren't going to do very much on this turn. If Jolteon uses Dig, it'll use Dig on Raikou, and if Jolteon attacks Latios, it's going to use Thunderbolt. The best thing to do is actually to Thunder Wave Jolteon with Raikou. It doesn't really matter what Jolteon's going to do, and Lapras is going to use Dragon Dance once again. We have enough time to leave Lapras on the field because it's just going to be very passive with Dragon Dance. In the meantime, we can Thunder Wave Jolteon and we can attack Jolteon with Latios. Again, this is very nitpicky, and I will say I think the reason that LRXC makes this mistake is because this is a very long live stream, and he's probably very tired after thinking so much of the previous Quagsire game. However, we are about to see quite a major mistake. So Thunderbolt goes into Lapras, and Latios will choose the Dragon Claw Jolteon. Jolteon does Thunderbolt Latios, which was very likely, and Jolteon is brought down to almost half HP. Unfortunately, the last Pokemon is Houndoom, which is actually incredibly scary. So why is Houndoom so scary? Well, this must be a high-risk Houndoom. The high-risk Houndoom either means Overheat from Houndoom 3 or 4, or Counter from Houndoom 1. But it doesn't really matter which one it is, they're all going to target Latios with either Crunch or Shadow Ball. and Latios is going to faint. Because they're all faster than Latios, Latios has no way of denying this kill. Raikou itself can kill Houndoom with Thunderbolt. However, this does leave a strange risk open, which is the fact that Jolteon might crit Latios here with Thunderbolt. This might seem like a very specific complaint. However, Jolteon 2 is Scope Lens. It has a 12.5% chance to crit Latios here. If Latios does get crit by Thunderbolt, it's going down. Gyarados is going to come in next, and Gyarados is also going to faint to Thunderbolt. In the meantime, Raikou cannot touch a Volt Absorb Jolteon. This is obviously a scenario that LRXC would want to avoid. And it means that actually the best idea here is not to use Thunderbolt into Houndoom at all, but to go for the Thunder Wave into Jolteon. After you Thunder Wave Jolteon, Gyarados is guaranteed to be faster than it, and Gyarados can simply go for the Hydro Pump into it as Raikou kills Houndoom next turn. This is obviously another reason why the turn before this, it was probably a better idea to Thunder Wave Jolteon instead of go for the Thunderbolt into the Lapras. But again, we should be sympathetic to LRXC for streaming for so long, and it seemed like such an obvious endgame play to just Thunderbolt Houndoom here and use Dragon Claw into Jolteon. Obviously, if Jolteon does not crit Latios, this is game over, including if Jolteon chooses to target Raikou. So Raikou banishes Houndoom to the Shadow Realm. Thunderbolt comes to Latios, and Latios does get crit by Thunderbolt. LRXC actually talks about Thunderbolt crit before it happens, and LRXC now realizes how dangerous the situation is. There's only one chance Gyarados has of surviving this turn. The only chance Gyarados has of surviving this turn is for Raikou to use Thunder Wave into Jolteon, and then Jolteon getting a full paralysis before using Thunderbolt into Gyarados. There's no dynamic speed in Generation 3, which means that even if you use Thunder Wave here against Jolteon, Jolteon is still going to act before Gyarados on this turn. So this endgame actually ends up taking almost 40 minutes, but to give a brief spoiler and to say something that some of you might spot fairly quickly, Raikou actually beats Jolteon in the endgame 1v1. And the fact that LRXC did not spot this before he went for the line does make it a bit of a mistake. However, Raikou is going to be bailed out quite hard here. So why does Raikou beat Jolteon? Well, first up, obviously, both Pokemon can't really touch each other. Jolteon's strongest move into Raikou is Dig, and Dig has the same amount of PP as Rest, except of course with Pressure, as Pressure will sap the PP from Dig much faster than Raikou can use Rest. While Dig can crit Raikou, Raikou also has to move Thunder Wave to interrupt Dig on terms of Jolteon's turns. Unlike in later generations, in Generation 3 it's actually much better to be the Pokemon who starts to use Struggle first. And because of the scenario that Raikou is in, it can both do this, or if it doesn't want to do this, they can of course use Rest as Jolteon is using Struggle itself. It's also important to remember this, Jolteon is actually at -2 attack because Gyarados has intimidated it twice. So Jolteon takes out Gyarados with Thunderbolt, and then we enter this weird endgame 1v1. Where Jolteon gets paralysed a lot and Raikou just spams a lot of moves to waste turns. Despite all of this, this is not completely safe. Of course, if Jolteon crits enough Thunderbolts, and remember this Jolteon does have Scope Lens, Raikou can actually lose this game. And Raikou's Rest PP being only 10 actually can be a problem, because even though Dig doesn't have enough PP to cause problems, Thunderbolt and Double Kick together both definitely do. And on top of this, Thunderbolt could paralyse Raikou, which could be a disaster if timed at a really bad moment. So LRXC was very upset about how he played this game, however I will say it's pretty understandable, and it seems like there's an easy path to winning just by using attacks. They are very easy to misplay. But of course, as I said, Raikou does win the stall war here. Now, if you enjoyed this video, LRXC is actually going live this Saturday, starting at 182 wins. I'm going to link LRXC's channel in the description. And as a shameless plug, I also stream. I don't stream on YouTube, I stream on Twitch, and you can go over there to watch me play various different facilities in the Frontier. And if you enjoyed this deep dive analysis, let me know. I can easily do more of these, either on LRXC or on different players in the factory community. I'm obviously keeping my fingers crossed that LRXC can beat the world record, which is currently standing at 185. Of course, that is only 3 wins away.